The brass seal had sat in the bottom drawer of my desk for 6 years, wrapped in the same soft cloth my grandfather used, doing nothing but waiting. I never expected it to be the thing that stopped my brother mid sentence in a conference room at a title company. But this really starts 11 months earlier at a birthday party with 90 candles on a sheet cake. My name is Annika Marsh. I'm 36, and for 9 years, I'd made my living as a mobile notary. I show up with a stamp and a journal and no opinion on what people sign, only whether they understand it. At my father's 90th birthday, my brother Grant stood up with a glass of sparkling cider and announced he'd finally handled Dad's estate the right way, the way you'd announce you'd finally gotten around to the gutters. I didn't put my fork down. I didn't ask him a single question. But what Grant didn't know was that 6 years earlier, I had notarized our father's original trust myself. It was sitting in my own journal, in my own handwriting the whole time. 11 months later, a closing officer would ask my brother one routine question he had no answer for. 2 weeks after that, my father would say the only apology I ever needed, though it wasn't really his to give. Nobody in that room saw it coming from quiet, unremarkable Annika, the sister who just stamps things. Welcome back to Calm Stories, where the ones who kept the peace for everyone else finally tell you the whole thing, calmly, start to finish. If a quiet kind of justice is your thing, settle in. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from, and go ahead and subscribe. Let me back up. Calder's Ridge is the kind of small town where the party store still stocks a shelf of over the hill banners because somebody always needs one. My father, Roy Marsh, turned 90 on a Saturday in September, and we rented the back room at the Elks Lodge because our childhood house couldn't fit 40 people anymore, not since my mother, Edith, died 3 years before. Edith Marsh did not spend a dollar without a reason, she could tell you out loud, and she raised my brother and me in a house where the good dishes came out twice a year and everything else was earned. Dad wore a paper crown that said Nidney and fine that my daughter picked out. He has what his doctor calls mild cognitive changes. Good days and slower days, nothing that's taken his independence, but enough that he repeats a story twice in an afternoon and calls me by my mother's name when he's tired. He is not a man anyone should be able to fool. He is, however, a man it has become very easy to rush. Grant is 43, 7 years older than me, and he has spent most of those 7 years being the one who handles things. He handles the lawn service. He handles Dad's mail, which he started doing 18 months ago when Dad's eyes got tired of small print. He handles the pharmacy calls. Nobody asked him to become the designated handler of Dad's life. He simply arrived one day already wearing the job, the way he'd arrived at every family gathering our whole lives already wearing the job of being the one who mattered more. I let him. That's the part I still have to sit with. I let him carry the mail in and out of that house for a year and a half without once asking to see what was in it, because asking felt like an accusation, and I have spent my whole life trying very hard not to be the sister who accuses people of things. There's a particular kind of test a family runs on you without ever calling it a test. 4 months before the birthday party, Grant called on a Tuesday evening and asked if I still had the spare key to Dad's safe deposit box, the one Mom had given me years earlier, back when I was the one who drove Dad to the bank twice a year for what we jokingly called its physical checkup. He said he wanted to get a proper look at what's actually in there before the holidays got busy, purely for organizational purposes, nothing more than that. I was tired that week. My daughter had strep. I'd been up 2 nights running with a fever thermometer and a bowl by her bed, and when Grant asked, I didn't hear a request I needed to weigh. I heard my brother offering to take one small thing off my plate. I mailed him the key the next morning without a second thought, the way you hand someone a door because they've asked nicely and you're too worn down to wonder why they're asking at all. I want you to sit with that for a second, the way I still do, because I know exactly what some of you are already thinking, and you'd be right to think it. Call the bank. Ask what he pulled. Go with him. I would never have mailed that key if I'd had one more hour of sleep that week. I mailed it anyway, and I didn't ask what he found inside when he got there, because at the time I still believed the version of my brother I'd built my whole life around. Overbearing sometimes, yes, always certain he knew better, but never once, in 36 years, dishonest. That version of Grant cost me 4 months of a head start I never got back. At the party, after the cider toast, Grant found me by the punch bowl. You'll get the paperwork this week, he said. Nothing dramatic. Dad and I talked it through, and it's what's fair. He said fair the way you'd say a word you'd rehearsed. I asked him which attorney had drawn it up. He said he'd used someone efficient and moved on to refill his plate before I could ask the name. I didn't chase him across the room. I have never once, in 36 years, chased Grant across a room, and I wasn't about to start over a paper plate of deviled eggs. I found my father instead, sitting by the window with his paper crown slightly crooked, and I straightened it for him, and he patted my hand and told me the same story about his first delivery truck that he'd already told me twice that morning, and I let him tell it a third time because some things matter more than being efficient. What he didn't know, and what Grant certainly didn't know, was that 6 years before that birthday, on an ordinary Tuesday, I had sat at my father's kitchen table with my notary stamp and my journal and watched him sign the original version of his trust, the one drawn up properly by an attorney he'd used for 30 years, back when signing something like that was still just an errand and not an emergency. I remembered it because it was one of maybe 4 times in my career I'd notarized a document for my own father, and because he'd made a joke about how his signature looked shakier than it used to, and I told him mine did too, and we both laughed about it. I hadn't thought about that Tuesday in years. I was about to think about it constantly. 2 days after the party, I drove to Dad's house to bring him his prescriptions, and Grant's car was already in the driveway. Through the front window, I could see him at the kitchen table with a folder, and my father across from him, pen in hand, signing something while Grant stood over his shoulder pointing at the line. I stood on the porch for exactly 4 seconds longer than I needed to before I knocked, because I wanted, very badly, for what I'd just seen to have an innocent explanation. Just some routine stuff for the new trust, Grant said, sliding the folder closed before I'd even set the pharmacy bag on the counter. You don't need to worry about it. I said I'd love to see it for my own peace of mind. I said it warmly. I said it the way you asked to see a photo of somebody's grandchild. Grant told me the attorney was finalizing the language and he'd send it over once it's clean. That was 11 days ago. It has not arrived. What he didn't know was that I'd already started keeping a folder of my own, not out of suspicion yet, not really. More the professional habit of a woman who has spent 9 years learning that when someone won't let you see a document, the document is usually the whole story. Here's what you should understand about my work because it matters for what comes later. A notary's journal isn't optional and it isn't casual. In this state, we're required by law to log every single document we notarize, the date, the signer's name, the type of identification they showed us, a thumbprint for anything involving real property or a power of attorney, and our own signature and seal. It sits in a locked book in the locked drawer for the rest of our working life, and it can be subpoenaed. Most people go their whole lives without ever needing to think about a notary's journal. I think about mine constantly because it is, in its quiet, unglamorous way, one of the most honest records that exists. It doesn't remember things the way people do. It doesn't soften anything for anyone's birthday. I would need someone to see it. But not yet. What she didn't know was that the folder I kept in the trunk of my car would grow heavier one Tuesday at a time for the next 11 months. 3 weeks after the birthday party, I called my father just to talk, the way I do most Sundays, and he mentioned almost in passing that the new fella helping with the paperwork had been by again. New fella. My father had known our family attorney, Malcolm Ferris, for over a decade. Malcolm had handled Mom's estate, had sat in our living room during 2 of the hardest weeks of our lives. If Grant had brought in someone new, it wasn't because Malcolm was unavailable. Malcolm was one phone call away and always had been. I called Malcolm that afternoon, not to accuse anyone of anything, just to ask in the most ordinary voice I could manage whether he'd been asked to review any updates to Dad's trust. He said no. He said, in fact, that nobody had contacted him about the Marsh estate in over a year, which was strange, since he still held the original documents in his file room downtown, including, he mentioned, a fully executed trust from 6 years ago that he'd always assumed was still the operative one. I didn't correct that assumption out loud. You don't tell someone the trap they're standing in before you understand its shape yourself. What Grant didn't know was that I had just made the first phone call of many, and that the man on the other end of it kept better files than anyone in our family. I want to tell you about my grandfather for a minute because he matters here too. Alias Marsh ran the only law office in Calder's Ridge for almost 40 years, back when a small town lawyer also functioned as the town's notary, its occasional marriage officiant, and its unofficial keeper of everybody's secrets. He died when I was 11, and the only thing of his I ever asked for was the brass embosser seal that sat on his desk my whole childhood. The one that stamped raised letters into paper, the old-fashioned kind, heavier than it looks. My mother gave it to me the week I got my notary commission, 27 years after he died, and said, "He'd have liked that you're the one who ended up doing this." I keep it in my desk drawer. I don't use it for daily work. Modern notary seals are ink stamps now, faster, cleaner. I keep the brass one because it was his, and because some mornings before appointments, I press it once into a scrap of paper just to feel the weight of it. It has never once, in 6 years, done anything except sit there. I remember one thing he told my father, which my father told me so many times it stopped feeling like a memory and started feeling like something I'd witnessed myself. That a notary's whole job, underneath the stamp and the fee and the routine of it, is to be a person other people can be honest in front of. Not a judge, not a friend, just a witness steady enough that the truth doesn't feel dangerous to say out loud. I didn't understand that as a child. I understood it, finally, the week I sat across a kitchen table from my own father and watched his hand shake slightly, signing his name, and felt for the first time exactly how much weight that stamp was supposed to carry. That's a story for later. Let me get back to the folder in my trunk. By the eighth week, I had three things in it: Malcolm's confirmation that no one had counterpanted him, a photocopy from my own journal, which I was legally entitled to reference for my own records, of the entry from 6 years earlier, my father's signature and thumbprint plain as anything, and a business card from the efficient attorney Grant had eventually named when I pushed him a second time, a man 2 counties over whose online reviews were thin and whose office, when I drove past it on an errand, I will admit was not entirely accidental, shared a strip mall with a vape shop and a text preparer. None of this proved fraud. I want to be honest with you about that, the way I've tried to be honest with myself the whole way through this. A family is allowed to update its estate plan. A son is allowed to help his aging father with paperwork. What a family is not allowed to do is what I started to suspect was happening the week I learned, from my niece in law of all people, that Grant's hardware distribution business had missed two supplier payments that spring, and that Bianca, Grant's wife, had been quietly picking up shifts at the pharmacy on weekends. Grant had never once in 15 years let anyone see him need anything. I didn't tell my father what I suspected. Not yet. There is a particular cruelty in making a 90-year-old man doubt his own son on the basis of a strip mall law office and a missed supplier payment, and I wasn't going to do that to him on a hunch. What Grant didn't know was that his wife's extra pharmacy shifts had already told me more than his silence had. I ran into Bianca herself outside the grocery store 2 days later, and she looked for a moment like she wanted to say something and then visibly decided against it. "Rory seems happy," she said instead, which is the kind of sentence people say when they mean something else entirely. I told her he was. I told her I was glad she'd stopped by to see him. I did not ask her the question sitting behind my teeth because I could see, in the particular way she wouldn't hold my eyes, that she already knew more than she wanted to. 6 weeks after the birthday party, I ran into our old neighbor, Mrs. Dunmore, at the pharmacy. She'd lived 2 doors down from my parents since before I was born, and she still kept the kind of watchful, affectionate eye on that street that comes from 40 years of knowing everyone's car by sound. "I saw a fellow with a clipboard measuring your dad's porch last week," she said, mostly a small talk the way you'd mention the weather. "Didn't recognize him? Assumed you all were finally fixing those gutters." I told her that sounded right, and I smiled, and I bought my father's blood pressure medication, and I sat in my car in the pharmacy parking lot for a long time afterward without turning the key. Nobody fixes gutters with a clipboard. That night, after my daughter was asleep, I did something I'd never once done in 9 years of respecting my own family's privacy. I searched the county property records for my father's address, the same public database I use professionally, several times a week for entirely different families. It took 4 minutes. What I found there stopped me at my own kitchen counter, still in my coat. A notice of trust had been recorded 11 days earlier. Not the full trust document itself, which isn't public record, but the notice that one existed, along with the name of the trust and the attorney who'd filed it. The attorney was the strip mall name Grant had eventually, reluctantly given me. The trust name included a phrase I didn't recognize from anything my father had ever called his own estate plan in 50 years of owning that house. I called the county assessor's office the next morning using my professional credentials, the ordinary way I'd call about any client's property, and asked for the most recent appraisal on file, $415,000. My father bought that house in 1974 for $18,000. He and my mother raised two children in it, buried a dog in the backyard, hosted 40 Thanksgivings in the dining room with the water stain on the ceiling. Neither of them ever fixed because fixing it felt like admitting the roof would someday need real money spent on it. $415,000 is not just a number. It is 51 years of a marriage, reduced to a figure on a county spreadsheet, quietly changing hands before the family that built those 51 years had even been shown the paperwork. I didn't call Grant that night. I didn't call my father either, not yet. I still couldn't stand the idea of putting that particular worry into a 90-year-old man's evening for no better reason than my own unconfirmed fear. What I did instead was print the notice, three-hole punch it, and add it to the folder in my trunk, which by then had stopped being a folder in any casual sense and had become something closer to a case file, though I wouldn't have called it that out loud yet. Not even to myself. I want to pause here and tell you something true about patience because it's the part of the story people ask me about most. Patience isn't waiting. It's knowing the right moment when it finally comes and refusing to move before you do. I had a house value, an attorney's name, a recording date, and a trust name that meant nothing to me yet. I did not have proof of anything. A daughter who loves her father does not accuse her brother on the strength of a clipboard and a county spreadsheet. So I kept driving to Calder's Ridge every Sunday with pharmacy bags, and I kept smiling at Grant across Dad's kitchen table, and I let him believe for a few more weeks that his sister was exactly as unremarkable as he'd always assumed. If this is hitting close to home, if you've ever sat in a parking lot holding a piece of paper that changed everything and still had to go inside afterward and act normal, drop a comment and subscribe, and let's get to the part where the paperwork finally catches up to him. I want you to notice something about me here because I think it says more than anything else I could tell you. I had, by this point, enough small circumstantial pieces to make a scene. I could have called a family meeting. I could have shown up at Dad's with the photocopy of my own journal entry and demanded Grant explain himself in front of everyone. I did not do that. I made an appointment instead with my own attorney, not Malcolm this time, a woman named Odette Prather who specializes in elder law, purely so that whatever I did next would be built on something sturdier than my own bad feeling about a strip mall. That was a small test, though I didn't call it that at the time. I told Grant over a Tuesday phone call about nothing in particular that I'd been thinking about updating my own will. Now that mom's gone and dad's getting older, it makes you think, and asked casually whether he'd mind sharing the name of the attorney he'd used, since I'd heard he was efficient. Grant went quiet for 2 full seconds, I counted, and then said he'd have to check and would get back to me. He did not get back to me. That silence told me more than a signed confession would have. What he didn't know was that I hadn't asked because I wanted an attorney. I'd asked to watch what he'd do with a door held open for him. He didn't walk through it. He closed it, gently, and changed the subject to the weather. Thanksgiving came before any of this resolved itself, and I want to tell you about it honestly because it was the worst holiday our family had had in years, and almost nobody at that table could have told you why. My father carved the turkey the way he always does, slower than he used to, and told the story about the year the oven died halfway through cooking, and Mom finished the bird on the neighbor's grill, which is a story I have heard perhaps 60 times in my life and will happily hear 60 more. Grant laughed too loudly at it. Bianca barely touched her plate. My own husband, who knew everything by then because I don't keep things like this from him, kept glancing at me across the table with the particular expression of a man watching his wife hold something heavy and pretend her arms aren't tired. At one point, clearing plates, my father caught my elbow in the kitchen and said quietly, "Something's not right between you two this year." Not a question. A 90-year-old man repeating stories twice in an afternoon, still sharp enough to feel the temperature of a room he couldn't have explained if you'd asked him to. I told him everything was fine, that Grant and I were just both tired, and I hated how easily the lie came out, because I have spent my whole life being the daughter who doesn't lie to her father. And that Thanksgiving, I did it 3 separate times before dessert. Grant found me alone by the dessert table later and said, low enough that no one else could hear, "You've been asking around about the attorney." Not a question either. I told him I'd been asking around about a lot of things since I was thinking about my own affairs, same as I told him weeks before. He looked at me for a long moment, really looked the way you look at someone when you're recalculating what they might already know, and said, "Dad's fine, Annika." Everything I've done because someone had to, and it sure wasn't going to be you. Driving in from 2 towns over with pharmacy bags like that fixes anything. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend 9 years of Sunday coffee and pharmacy runs to a man who clearly already decided what kind of sister I was. I said, "You're right that someone had to," and I let him hear whatever he wanted to hear in that sentence. And I went back to the table and ate a piece of pie I don't remember tasting. That was the moment I stopped hoping I was wrong. Stay with me. The part that changed everything is coming, and I promise you it isn't a shouting match. Hit subscribe so it finds you when it lands. By early winter, 4 months after the party, Odette had helped me formally understand something I hadn't fully appreciated, because I was the notary of record on my father's original valid trust. And because that trust had never been formally revoked through the same channel, any new instrument attempting to replace it would eventually have to pass through a title company or the county recorder's office if it touched real property. And my father's house, the one he'd lived in for 51 years, was very much real property. Instruments like that get cross checked against whatever's already on file. It's not glamorous, it's not even rare. It's just paperwork doing what paperwork is built to do, slowly in the background, whether anyone's watching or not. I didn't do anything with that information yet. I filed it the way you file a receipt you might need later, and I kept driving to Calder's Ridge every Sunday with pharmacy bags and patients, and I kept my mouth shut about strip malls and missed supplier payments, and some nights that silence cost me more than I let on, even to my own husband. What she didn't know is that the patience was the plan. Here's the part I need to slow down for because it's the part that changed what the rest of this story was actually about. It was a Tuesday in November. I remember because Tuesdays had become, without my planning it, the day I did this kind of thinking, and I'd stopped by Dad's after an appointment 2 towns over. He was in the kitchen making the same coffee he'd made every morning of his adult life, and he asked me, out of nowhere, whether I remembered the day at the table, meaning the Tuesday 6 years earlier when I'd notarized his trust. I said I did. He said, "You didn't even charge me for that one." I told him I never would have. He nodded slow and said, "Your grandfather used to say the stamp isn't the important part. Anybody can buy a stamp." He said the important part is being the kind of person people can hand something to and trust it'll still be there when they come back for it. I don't know if he remembered saying that to me himself 25 years before when he handed me the brass seal in its cloth. I don't think it mattered whether he remembered. What mattered was that a small, ordinary moment in a kitchen, no confrontation in it anywhere, nothing dramatic, just two people and bad coffee, was the moment something in me stopped auditioning. I had spent 11 weeks trying to be certain enough, careful enough, fair enough to Grant before I let myself believe what the receipts were already telling me. Somewhere between his sentence about the stamp and mine about the coffee, I stopped needing to be certain. I already knew. Something changes in a woman the year she stops asking her brother's silence for permission to trust her own eyes. I didn't cry standing in that kitchen. I didn't call Grant and confront him. I did one small thing instead. I drove home and I called Odette and told her I was ready to file a formal request, not an accusation, a request for a full accounting of any changes made to my father's estate plan in the past 18 months, made through my father's own continuing legal standing as a beneficiary and interested party. It is by design one of the least dramatic documents a person can file. It sits in a clerk's inbox. It does not announce itself, it simply exists quietly until something needs it. That was the first act, not revenge, just a woman finally trusting the paperwork she'd spent her whole life learning to trust for everyone else. What Grant didn't know was that the request had already been filed 3 weeks before he did what he did next. He must have sensed something shifting, even without knowing why, because 2 weeks later he called to tell me he'd gotten everything moving and scheduled a closing for the property transfer piece of the new trust. Dad's house retitled into arrangement Grant described vaguely as better for tax purposes. He wanted it done before the holidays, he said, so Dad doesn't have to think about it during Christmas. I noticed, and I want you to notice too, that every explanation Grant gave for moving quickly was framed as protecting our father from a burden. Not one of them was framed as anything he was doing for himself. The closing was set for a Thursday morning at a title company in the next county, not the strip mall attorney's office, a proper title company, which told me the attorney had done at least that much correctly. Grant asked if I wanted to come. I think, in his mind, inviting me was the generous thing, the thing that proved there was nothing to hide. I said I'd be there. What he didn't know was that a title company doing a property transfer involving an existing family trust is required, as a matter of ordinary procedure, to pull whatever's already recorded against that property, including, when relevant, prior notarized instruments still on file with either the county or with the notary who executed them. He also didn't know that I'd mentioned weeks earlier in an entirely unrelated conversation with Odette that I still held the original notary journal entry for a trust executed 6 years prior on that same property, and that she had, quietly and correctly, made sure the title company handling Thursday's closing was aware an earlier instrument might exist before anyone walked into that room. I hadn't set a trap. I want to be clear about that because it matters to how I feel about all of it now. I had simply finally let the truth be somewhere it could be found. The morning of the closing, I wore the same gray cardigan I wear to every appointment, ordinary as any Tuesday, and I put my grandfather's brass seal in my bag without entirely deciding why. Some habits don't need reasons. Malcolm Ferris met me in the parking lot because I'd finally told him everything 2 nights before, and because a man who'd known my family for 30 years wasn't about to let me walk into that room alone. My father came too, in the good coat he still insisted on wearing, unaware, as far as I could tell, that anything about this Thursday was different from any other. Bianca came with Grant. I don't think she wanted to. I think, by then, she already knew what the morning held and had decided that whatever was coming, she'd rather be in the room for it than hear about it secondhand. The closing officer's name was Priyanka, and she had the calm, procedural manner of someone who has spent a career watching other people's biggest moments arrive in the shape of paperwork. She laid the new documents on the table. She asked Grant, first, to confirm his father's continuing capacity and the chain of legal authority behind the update. Grant, smiling, began to answer. That's when Priyanka said, checking her screen, I'm showing an existing notarized trust instrument on file for this property, executed 6 years ago. Before we proceed, I'll need to reconcile that against today's document or confirm it was formally revoked. The room went quiet in a way a birthday party toast never manages. My father's wine glass. No, it wasn't wine, it was black coffee in a paper cup, but it paused on its way to his mouth all the same. Grant said, That's. I wasn't aware there was an earlier one on file, which was, I would come to understand over the following weeks, the truest sentence he said that entire morning, because he genuinely hadn't known. He'd been so certain no earlier instrument existed that he never checked. Bianca's hand had gone still on the table, flat against the wood, the way you steady yourself against something before you know you're about to need steadying. My father looked between his two children with an expression I hadn't seen on him since the week my mother died. Not confusion, exactly. Recognition arriving slower than it should have. I set my folder on the table. I laid the copies down one at a time, the way you'd read a verdict you didn't write, the journal entry. My own notary seal from 6 years back, matching the one still active on my commission today. My father's original signature beside the new one Grant had brought, and even to an untrained eye, once you set them side by side, the new signature leaned wrong, the pen pressure wrong, a signature made by a hand that was tired in a way, my father's hand, on that particular week, according to his own doctor's notes, Odette had subpoenaed, had no documented reason to be. Dad, I said, do you remember signing this one, the new one from a few months ago? I kept my voice exactly the same as it would have been asking about the weather. My father looked at the page for a long moment. I remember Grant bringing me papers, he said slowly. I don't know that I remember reading this particular one all the way through. Grant started talking then, faster than I'd heard him talk in years, about tax purposes and efficiency, and how none of this was what it looked like. Nobody at that table was raising their voice except him. Priyanka, still entirely calm, said she'd need to pause the closing pending a formal reconciliation, and that given the discrepancy, she was obligated to note it in the file. Malcolm said quietly that given what he was seeing, he'd be recommending my father's original attorney relationship, meaning himself be reinstated immediately, and that a formal review of the intervening instrument would need to happen before anything touching that house moved forward again. A screaming man and a calm woman laying photocopies on a table in order do not look like equals in that kind of room. They look like exactly what they are. Here's the fallout because I promised you this whole thing, start to finish, and I meant it. The new trust was never recorded. Priyanka's flag stopped it cold, and Malcolm's formal review in the weeks after confirmed what the signature comparison had already suggested. The strip mall attorney had prepared the document based entirely on Grant's representations, without ever independently verifying my father's understanding of what he was signing, which is its own kind of violation even before you get to the signature itself. Grant did not go to prison. I want to be honest about that too, because this isn't that kind of story. But the county's Elder Affairs office opened a formal inquiry. Grant was removed as any kind of authorized party on our father's accounts, and the strip mall attorney lost his ability to notarize documents in this state entirely within the year after it turned out mine wasn't the only file that got a second look. Grant and Bianca's marriage did not survive the winter. I don't say that with any satisfaction. Bianca called me in February, crying, and told me she'd known more than she'd let herself admit. And I told her I understood, and I meant it, because I've spent a long time learning the particular exhaustion of loving someone you're afraid to ask hard questions. My father's house is his own again, fully the way it always should have been. I refused any additional share Malcolm suggested I might be entitled to as compensation for what I'd caught. I didn't do any of this for money, and taking extra now would have made the whole 11 months about something it never was. What I asked for instead, the only thing, was for my grandfather's original journal habits to become the family's habit too. Every document that touches that house from now on gets independently reviewed by an attorney with no stake in the outcome, no exceptions, not even for me. My father still lives in that house. He still makes the same coffee every morning, still tells the story about his first delivery truck, still calls me by my mother's name on his slower days, and I've stopped correcting him when he does, because I've come to think it isn't a mistake so much as a kind of company he's keeping with her. Odette helped us set up something we should have had years ago, an independent professional trustee for the parts of his estate that will eventually need managing so that no single family member, including me, ever holds that much unwatched authority over him again. My father signed those new documents himself, slowly at his own kitchen table, with two independent witnesses and Malcolm sitting beside him the whole time. Nobody rushed him. Nobody stood over his shoulder pointing at the line. Grant and I don't speak now. Not out of anger, not any more. Out of the plain fact that trust, once it's gone missing from a family that size, doesn't always find its way back to every room. I sent him one message in December that said only, I hope you get the help your business needed some other way. I never got a reply, and I've made my peace with that. My father and I have Sunday coffee every week now, same as always, except I stay a little longer. 2 weeks after the closing, he took my hand across that same kitchen table and said, I should have asked to see the paperwork myself. I trusted the wrong version of easy. It wasn't really his apology to give. The strip mall attorney and my brother made those choices, not him, but I understood what he meant. And I told him so, and we let it be enough. I still keep my grandfather's brass seal in my desk drawer. I still don't use it for daily work. But some mornings now, before appointments, I press it into a scrap of paper and I think about a man I barely remember, who believed the whole job was just being someone people could hand something to and trust it would still be there. I think he'd have liked how this one turned out. Here's what I've learned, and I'll say it plainly because I think somebody listening needs to hear it today. The truth doesn't need you to shout it. It just needs somewhere honest to sit until somebody finally checks. That's my story. One birthday cake, one brass seal that finally did its job, and a closing table where the quietest person in the room turned out to be the one holding the last piece of paper. If someone in your life is counting on you never asking to see the paperwork, take this as your sign to ask anyway. Gently, without accusation, the way you'd ask to see a photo of somebody's grandchild. You're allowed to want to see it. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.